From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Monday, May 4th, 2015. On today's show, we'll get an update on the Saudi-led war in Yemen. The Saudis are claiming Houthi rebels are proxy Iranian soldiers, while others see Saudi Arabia as a proxy for the U.S. My guest, Gareth Porter, will shed light on the issue. And analyst Ajamu Baraka breaks down the latest in the police brutality protests in Baltimore, plus Marc Solomon of Freedom to Marry will explain what's at stake in the latest gay marriage case before the U.S. Supreme Court. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Christina Mislan, sitting in for Rahul Mahajan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Christina.
Hello, Sonali.
Two men were fatally shot by police in a Dallas, Texas suburb called Garland last night after a security guard was killed outside an event being hosted by controversial Islamophobe Pamela Geller. The event was a contest to draw caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad with a $10,000 prize. It is not yet confirmed if the Sunday attack was aimed at Geller's event. One of the two deceased men was just identified as Elton Simpson of Phoenix, Arizona. Federal prosecutors in Arizona had charged Simpson 5 years ago for planning a trip to Somalia to wage jihad. Geller is prominent for her high-profile campaigns maligning the Muslim community in the U.S. The Southern Poverty Law Center considers Geller's group, the American Freedom Defense Initiative, or AFDI, as an extremist organization, and some have compared Sunday's attack to the Paris attacks on Charlie Hebdo magazine, which satirized, among others, the Islamic faith. Well, Christina, if indeed the attack was aimed at the drawing contest, do you foresee this event being labeled a terrorist attack?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that it will be labeled as a terrorist attack. And as you just mentioned, it's already being framed as another Charlie Hebdo attack in some reports. And so what I think, as we've seen in the past, is that anytime there's a response, albeit a violent one, to people who claim they're exercising their freedom of speech with hate speech, right, the label becomes one of terrorism. And what I think this allows people then to do is to blame the people who carried out the attack instead of looking at the root of the problem. We don't ask questions like, well, why is violence the outcome? Which would actually make us reflect on the Islamophobic culture that we have in this country, but also the violence that this country enacts on Muslims around the world.
And the Israeli capital of Tel Aviv has been racked by protests over the treatment of Israelis of Ethiopian background. A video of an Ethiopian Israeli being beaten by police emerged last week, sparking existing tensions in a community that has long felt discriminated against. Dozens of people were arrested and dozens more, police and protesters, injured in clashes over the weekend. There are more than 130,000 Ethiopian Israelis among the 8 million citizens of the country. The police involved in the videotaped beating have been suspended. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin said the protest, quote, revealed an open and raw wound in Israeli society and that the community's grievances must be addressed. Well, Christina, some have called what is happening in Israel as its Baltimore moment. Is that a good description?
Well, I think we need to be careful ascribing a U.S. and American event to another international event. And I say that because the Israeli government has a record of human rights violations. That's including minorities in Israel, but also in Palestine. And so I think this isn't new. And of course, Freddie Gray's murder isn't either, right? And so we can definitely see a similarity between the treatment and protests of Ethiopian Israelis against what they are calling the police state, with a similar structure in the United States. And so I think it's not only a Baltimore moment, but these events are illuminating to us what happens when state violence is an everyday occurrence for people who are still fighting for full citizenship rights within the nation state. So I think it's important to note that these events seem so similar because also it's really reflective of a long-form policy strategy that intersects U.S. policies with those of Israel as well.
And finally, Italy's Coast Guard has rescued nearly 7,000 migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean Sea over the weekend. The huge number of migrants that apparently launched from the Libyan coast were rescued from various types of vessels, including a cargo ship, a tugboat, a fishing boat, and an inflatable dinghy. At least 10 people were found to have died. A baby girl was born aboard one of the ships. Both mother and child are well. The huge spike in migration over the weekend was likely the result of calm seas and warm weather. In mid-April, 500 migrants died attempting to cross the sea to Europe, prompting a major meeting by EU officials. Still, right-wing French politician Marine Le Pen said yesterday that France should simply send the migrants back so, quote, traffickers know that no migrant will come ashore on our coasts. Now, Christina, it appears as though Italy is trying to do the right thing, at least, by rescuing the migrants. Do you think this migration crisis is a major test of Europe's claim to respect human rights?
I do. I definitely think this is a moment for European countries to actually maybe even set an example for maybe the United States, right? And so for a while now, we've seen many European countries implement repressive immigration policies towards citizens of African nations as well as the global South. And so I think what we've also seen is European countries, how they've treated immigrants once they do land, if they can, right? Homelessness, racism, poverty are common consequences of these policies that have been implemented. So I think this is a moment where the EU can actually do something different, right? And so it could be a start to better immigration reform. And I say this with complete understanding that the US confronts very similar issues with immigration as well. And so hopefully we can learn from Italy here.
Christina, thank you so much for joining us as always, and we'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you.
Christina Mislan is sitting in for Rahul Mahajan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism and one of our daily Newsflash guest experts. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. News media reporting that a mysterious group of anti-Houthi fighters has entered the embattled country of Yemen. The fighters are calling themselves the Southern Resistance Committees and are fueling speculation that they are Saudi Arabian ground troops. Saudi Arabia has been waging a weeks-long air war against Yemen with U.S. support after that country was taken over by Shia rebels called the Houthis. So far, more than 1,000 people, including 550 civilians, have been killed from a combination of airstrikes and some ground fighting. While Saudi airstrikes target cities like the capital Sana'a, ground troops are stationed along the border at checkpoints. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has warned that Yemen's infrastructure is, quote, on the brink of collapse. My guest is Gareth Porter, investigative journalist and historian specializing in national security policy. His most recent book is called Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. He recently wrote the piece, Houthi Arms Bonanza Came from Saleh, Not Iran. Welcome to Uprising, Gareth.
Thanks very much, Sonali. Good morning.
Thanks for joining us. Well, what does Saudi Arabia, before we get to some of these news reports about this mysterious new group of ground troops, what does Saudi Arabia base its allegations on that the Houthi rebellion in Yemen is being supported by the Iranian government? Is there any real evidence of this?
Well, there's a new report that has not been made public officially, but has already been leaked to the news media by a committee of experts, a group of experts that was commissioned by the UN Security Council committee that's dealing with sanctions against the Houthis and the former President Saleh. And this is a committee that has a committee of experts that has carried out a study of the alleged support by Iran to the Houthis. And I've just been reading the latest Agence France Presse piece based on this leak of the report, which is citing a series of incidents that the Yemen government claims shows that Iran was shipping weapons to the Houthis as far back as 2009. The problem that I have found with these reports is that it is not at all clear that these involve, in fact, arms that were being shipped from Iran to Yemen, as opposed to arms that were coming from Yemen to Eritrea, where apparently there has been a connection between Yemeni sources of arms and the Eritrean liberation movement. So there's a real question mark here, which still has to be investigated, and that's something that I'm planning to do in the coming weeks.
Now, if the Houthis are being seen as Iranian proxies, rightly or wrongly, what about the argument that the Saudis are U.S. proxies?
Well, the term proxy, of course, is fairly slippery. It's not very well defined. But usually I think what the term connotes is that the lesser party in the relationship is actually dependent on the stronger party, and in fact is carrying out tasks that are at the behest of the stronger party. And I think the situation regarding the United States and Saudi Arabia is a bit more complex than that, to say the least, because the U.S. government, let's put it this way, certain key bureaucracies in the national security state of the United States have been extremely close to Saudi Arabia, entering into partnerships with them. And I'm talking about the National Security Agency, the NSA, the CIA, as well as the Pentagon. They all have extremely close relations with parts of the Saudi government. And I would say that the CIA and the NSA really even closer than the Pentagon. But the Pentagon, on the other hand, I make this point in a new piece that it was just published in Al Jazeera English this morning. I make the point that the Pentagon has become very dependent on the idea of Iran as an enemy in selling weapons to the Saudis and other Gulf sheikdoms, which are now worth more than $150 billion over the next decade to 2 decades to arms manufacturers in the United States and the Pentagon. So this is an extremely important nexus of interest between the U.S. national security state and the Saudis, which means that there's much more equality in the relationship than one might expect otherwise.
Right. Now, what about, going back to Iran's role, what about Iran's role in delivering aid to Yemen? There was a report last week that Saudi Arabia apparently shot down an Iranian plane attempting to deliver aid, and I believe even Iran has admitted that that is a role that it is playing. But in shooting down this plane, air deliveries of aid have stopped, and in general, the population is being sort of cut off from receiving aid from the outside, which is a very dangerous trend.
Well, that's right. And I think we have to stop and look at this situation in terms of what the both political and legal aspects of the situation are. You have really a situation of no well-established government, but the previous government, which was Saudi-sponsored and supported by the United States and its Western allies as well, of course, was overthrown, not so much overthrown as essentially left the country at the insistence, it appears, of the Saudis themselves. First of all, former President Hadi left the capital Sana'a and went to Aden, and in the south, and then as the Houthis were closing in on that city, he escaped by boat to Saudi Arabia and is now in Riyadh. So what the Saudis are relying on is a government in exile rather than the request for intervention from a government within Yemen. And you know, one can argue that, and I think that it's probably fair to argue that the Houthis and their allies within Yemen represent the closest thing to a functioning government at this point, and that if you're going to look at the question of sending humanitarian assistance to Yemen, and there is indeed, according to UN sources, a humanitarian crisis in Yemen because of the Saudi bombing, then you have to you know, give that aid with the cooperation of the existing authorities in Sana'a. And that, of course, means the Houthis and their allies, meaning the officials who are loyal to former President Saleh.
No. What about, Gareth, the fact that there have been reports alleging that there were talks in the works between Houthi rebels and other rebel groups that were close to an agreement and a ceasefire and a power-sharing deal right before the Saudis began bombing the country? Joe Laurie of the Wall Street Journal reported this, and now the bombing campaign has resulted in a sort of a toughening of the positions of these various rebel groups, making a deal even harder to reach. Does this have, you know, is this something that really needs to get out? Because most people might see Saudi Arabia as, you know, swooping in to save the day, when in fact it might have ruined the possibility of peace on the ground.
Well, I think this is an extremely credible report. It's clearly a report that reflects the views and the experience of the UN mediator in Yemen, Ben Omar, Jamal Ben Omar of Morocco. And I think it's certainly very credible that this was indeed precisely the case, that they were in fact working toward a political settlement between the Houthis and various other political elements in Sana'a, and that the Saudis did not want that to happen, precisely because they want to restore the old regime, plain and simple. They wanted to return to the situation before September 2014. And so their instrument for doing that, of course, was the bombing campaign. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that indeed what happened was that the Saudis deliberately disrupted the possibility of an agreement by carrying out the bombing campaign and basically making it, you know, the Houthis then responded with their own counteroffensive.
Now, Gareth, while all of this is happening with the Saudi bombing of Yemen, the U.S. negotiations with Iran are continuing. This is over a nuclear deal between the U.S. and Iran, and represent, with Iran's new leadership, a warming of relations between the two countries, a better chance of that happening now than in recent memory. What is the status of those talks, and does Yemen figure into it, given that Saudis are big U.S. allies and, of course, are unhappy about Iran's role in Yemen? Is Yemen figuring into the nuclear talks between the U.S. and Iran?
Well, I think you could argue that you know, the reason, part of the reason, certainly not the primary reason, but part of the reason that the Saudis have taken the actions that they have been as aggressive militarily as they have in Yemen, is precisely because they are so worried that the United States is going to reach a rapprochement with Iran. And in fact, I heard the former chief of Saudi intelligence, Prince Turki, in London last month, make a statement that simply attributed to the Obama administration the intention to make Iran a quasi-ally. In fact, he used a sexual metaphor in his talk to describe that growing likelihood, from his point of view, of a new relationship between the United States and Iran. But I happen to think that that's a extreme misperception on the part of the Saudis, who are their judgment is extremely clouded, unfortunately, by their narrow sectarian viewpoint on politics in the region, and they mistake their desire to support and to essentially propound Wahhabi religious views throughout the region and indeed throughout the world, with the idea that the Iranians are a threat to take over the Middle East.
Right.
And I think that therefore the Saudis have an extremely exaggerated view of this problem, and therefore it undoubtedly entered into their calculus in terms of using force in Yemen.
Now, Gareth, what do you make of the reports that there is a possibility that this group calling themselves the Southern Resistance Committees are actually Saudi ground troops, and Houthi rebels reportedly launched their first retaliatory attack on Saudi Arabia since the start of the three-week air war last week. 3 Saudi troops were killed. Do you see, because of course Saudi Arabia and Yemen share a border, do you see these sorts of cross-border incursions escalating into a serious ground war? And of course we should mention there are clashes on the ground inside Yemen between various rebel groups. With the Saudis sending in ground troops, the possibility of civilians being killed in ground clashes does increase as well.
Well, I think there are 2 points that I would make about the possibility that the Saudis already have ground troops in Yemen, or indeed may be planning to do so. The first one is that the Saudis do in fact have well-established proxies in Yemen, apart from their support for the former government of President Saleh and his successor, President Hadi. They also have had a very aggressive role for many, many years, going back even before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, in supporting and giving financing to Wahhabi style Sunnis in Yemen. And indeed, this was part of the reason, this was the primary reason why you had a resistance movement formed by the Houthis, because it was in their territory that the Saudis were extremely aggressive many years ago and began to promote the Salafist, if not Wahhabi, religious groups in that area. So they have been continuing to give active support to forces that represent this Wahhabi or Salafist point of view within Yemen to fight against the Houthis. And we know that that includes some groups that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda as well in Yemen. So that, I think, has been clearly the primary choice of the Saudis in terms of fighting the Houthis. Now,
And Gareth, there's also reports that ISIS has appeared in Yemen. They're literally just calling themselves ISIS in Yemen, released one of their trademark gruesome videos showing the killing of a number of Yemeni Houthi soldiers. Could this also complicate matters there?
Well, of course, absolutely. The presence of ISIS is an extreme threat to the Houthis because, like Al-Qaeda, ISIS will absolutely target the Houthis for terrorist actions. The Al-Qaeda people have been doing that for years now, carrying out terrorist bombings against Houthi civilian targets. So that's going to add fuel to the flames there. But I just wanted to say that that the Saudis, in my view, are unlikely to send ground forces into Yemen. First of all, because they're simply not very good at fighting on the ground outside their own territory. They don't have that kind of experience. They don't have training for it. And I think the U.S. officials have been saying privately and even publicly that the Saudis are not likely to intervene. And I think that they are saying that primarily because they know that the Saudis would rather not get involved in that sort of a scrap with the Houthis, who are much better than they are in that sort of fighting.
Well, Gareth, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and helping sort out some of these issues as we continue to follow the war in Yemen. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Gareth Porter is an investigative journalist and historian specializing in national security policy. His most recent book is called Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare. We'll go from Yemen to Baltimore after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. 6 officers from the Baltimore Police Department have been charged and arrested in a surprise announcement made by State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby last Friday. Officer Cesar Goodson Jr., who drove the van carrying Freddie Gray, has been slapped with the most charges. Here is Mosby reading out the charges on Friday morning.
The manner of death, deemed a homicide by the Maryland State Medical Examiner, is believed to be the result of a fatal injury that occurred while Mr. Gray was unrestrained by a seatbelt in the custody of the Baltimore Police Department wagon. All events occurred in Baltimore City, state of Maryland. While each of these officers are presumed innocent until proven guilty, we have brought the following charges. Officer Cesar Goodson is being charged with second-degree depraved heart murder, involuntary manslaughter, second-degree negligent assault, manslaughter by vehicle by means of gross negligence, manslaughter by vehicle by means of criminal negligence, misconduct in office, for failure to secure a prisoner, failure to render aid.
And that's Marilyn Mosby reading out the charges against Cesar Goodson Jr. The 5 other officers, including 1 female officer, have been charged with various combinations of these. All were arrested and have posted bail. 3 of the officers are African American. The case is being seen as a major test of Mosby's career. She came into office on the campaign promise of holding police accountable. She hails from a family of police going back at least 3 generations. Reactions to her announcement within Baltimore included cheers of joy and raucous car honking on the streets. Maryland Representative Elijah Cummings said, quote, "It is a new day in our city. Let the wheels of justice begin to roll." Freddie Gray's death is hardly unusual in Baltimore, a city that has been racked by the deaths and brutal beatings of scores of African Americans at the hands of police within just the past few years. My guest is Ajamu Baraka, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and editor and columnist for Black Agenda Report. He just wrote the piece Baltimore and the Human Right to Resistance, Rejecting the Framework of the Oppressor. Welcome to Uprising, Ajamu.
My pleasure to be here.
Now, did you expect charges to be filed on Friday? Are you convinced of Marilyn Mosby's sincerity?
Well, I'm convinced that she was under tremendous political pressure to render some kind of charge against some or a combination of those individual police personnel involved in this horrific murder. And that pressure came primarily from the people themselves. You know, many people condemn the uprising in Baltimore, but one wonders that if there would not have been an aggressive response from the public, whether or not sufficient political pressure would have been applied that resulted in these charges. I think she's sincere in the sense that she has that objective to dissipate the anger. Whether or not is something that we need to celebrate is something to discuss.
Right, and it remains to be seen, of course, if there is a fair prosecution and, of course, a conviction. Now, one of the things that hasn't been getting as much attention, but the Wall Street Journal just reported on it, was that one of the charges facing the officers was a charge of illegal arrest. I mean, she essentially said it is not illegal for Freddie Gray to have, made eye contact with the officers. Even the knife that they recovered from him was a legal knife that he had legally had the right to carry. And so she actually put out the charge saying that the arrest itself could be seen as illegal. The Wall Street Journal says police officers nationwide could become more careful about apprehending suspects. Well, shouldn't they always be careful anyway?
Well, of course they should, and I think this is one of the most interesting things to come out of this indictment, and that is that she did level the charges that the contact and the subsequent arrest was in fact illegal. That should put police personnel on notice, but all that really means is that they're going to be more careful in terms of constructing the reason why they may have stopped someone and then subsequently arrested them. But it is a good, I think, positive step in the right direction in terms of reversing the sense of impunity that many police personnel have in the United States of America.
Now, some have mentioned or brought up the fact that the police bail was set at between $250,000 and $300,000 each, and yet some of the protesters that have been charged with vandalizing city property have gotten $500,000 of bail. And there's also fears that the officers, if they're sort of charged wrongfully or wrongly, might get off on a technicality, like the officer in the Rekia Boyd case in Chicago. The judge thought he was actually guilty, but not of the charge, the specific charge that was brought against him, and he could, and so he essentially walked free. Now, given the array of charges that these officers have been slapped with, maybe that is a smaller possibility. But how careful which should we be here in celebrating what happened on Friday? Because there's, of course, the danger that we might feel justice has already been served.
Well, that's a very, I think, accurate observation in terms of how this judicial process operates in the U.S. Now, one of the things that, as you pointed out in your question, that's different is that the array of charges allows for the possibility of the more serious charges being dismissed, but with the possibility that they will, in fact, be convicted on lesser charges. I mean, for example, the van driver, those are some very serious charges that have to be proven because there's a argument that suggests that the real serious injuries occurred before he was in fact handcuffed and shackled and put in the back of that van. So yeah, there's always that possibility of overcharging that then allows for the police personnel to escape real accountability. But in this case, I think that's been prevented.
Now, what about the fact that there is a different reaction, a very different reaction from authorities in Baltimore than there was in Ferguson last year? And I'm wondering if you can comment on the sort of evolution that we seem to have seen because perhaps of the protests. Last year in Ferguson, Missouri, the Ferguson prosecutor, Robert McCulloch, made a long-winded announcement before finally revealing that Darren Wilson would not face any charges. And that, of course, sparked a major uprising there. Many people see what happened in Ferguson as the escalation and the real sort of official beginning to the Black Lives Matter movement. In Baltimore, it seems as though the protests have finally had some effect, that months and months of protests are putting the authorities on notice. Are you optimistic?
Well, I'm optimistic in the sense that the people's resistance resulted in this prosecution. I think the real difference between Ferguson and Baltimore is that the attitudes of the American people appear to be somewhat different. It was not that unexpected that the police personnel were going to walk in Ferguson, even though there was this very adamant and aggressive response from the people. In Baltimore, because of the particular dynamics of race and class, that likelihood still existed, but as a consequence of the resistance from the people, they created a political situation that made it much more difficult for the authorities to allow these officers to in fact walk. So, you know, evolution, I'm not sure. I think the circumstances are much different. In fact, the circumstances in Baltimore were even more dangerous in terms of winning real accountability.
Now, does the charging of officers dilute the drive to protest? Do the cities involved, and of course there's so many cities, Ferguson, Chicago, LA, Baltimore, do cities end up essentially buying time and diffusing anger when they charge the officers? And if so, don't they simply have to ensure there are no convictions by the time that people's anger has subsided a little bit?
Well, you know, that's one approach that some cities may engage in. I mean, when there's sufficient pressure that requires some indictment or will motivate them to take charges to a grand jury, hoping to buy time to dissipate the tensions and the anger in the community. But there's also another pushback, and that is that police unions across the country are suggesting that local authorities are bending to the pressure of the communities in sacrificing their members. So there's this argument that a hard line needs to be taken, and that if there's not sufficient and clear evidence to charge police personnel, that local authorities should not do that. They should not sacrifice people's lives for political expediency. So there is this pushback that's taking place, and it's a very interesting one because it appears that there is some degree of support from some sectors of the population to that hardline stand. So, you know, as this drama plays out in the U.S. in terms of police violence, there's going to be some very interesting twists and turns. I'm not one of the ones who are very optimistic and cheer the fact that they were indicted. I'm concerned about the accountability and justice for Freddie Gray, but we've got to keep the focus on the objective mission of the police forces in the U.S., which is basically to control and to contain a population that's been rendered economically and socially redundant in contemporary U.S. realities.
Ajamu, in a piece that you recently wrote about Baltimore, the question of violence is a very interesting one that I'd like you to discuss a little. It comes up repeatedly in the attention being focused on vandalism and property destruction at protests is condemned far more loudly than, of course, police killings themselves. And yet some people within the movement or even supportive of the movement say that the movement needs to be extremely disciplined and be extremely peaceful because then you have the sort of moral authority to speak up. But if the protests in Ferguson had not broken, if there hadn't been a single broken window, or even in Baltimore, would there have been any press coverage? Would anybody outside of those cities have really paid attention?
I would argue that not really. We've had a series of peaceful protests, and the result has been that there's been no real accountability.
Yeah, we've had years of peaceful protests.
Exactly. And people have to be reminded that when the resistance started in Ferguson, there was, in fact, in the beginning, some assaults on property. There was some so-called looting. But yet the response from the public in general in the U.S. Was somewhat different than what happened in Baltimore. When there was the assaults on property in Baltimore, there was this attack on the resistance led by members of the black middle class, the authorities that are in charge in Baltimore. And even the President of the United States labeled those individuals as thugs and, in fact, criminals. That opened up a floodgate of language, negative language, of negative characterization of the resistance that was quite unfortunate, because what happened was people across the country, in particular in the white communities, began to say things that they may have felt constrained to say during the situation in Ferguson. So before we knew it, the whole narrative had been shifted away from the need for accountability for the death of Freddie Gray to the tactics of the resistance. And that happened also because, many people, including members of the black so-called leadership class, don't seem to understand or have forgotten the difference between protest and resistance. Oppressed people have a right to resist. They have a right to struggle for liberation. They have a right to transform themselves and their conditions. And that right cannot be constrained by the legal niceties emanating from the oppressor. So this is the kind of sense of where we need to go in this country that people need to be reacquainted with. We're not going to allow ourselves to be restricted by the ethical framework of the oppressor. We want transformation, and we're going to get it by any means necessary.
Now, Ajamu, in your piece, you also wrote how it might be, quote, a little disconcerting for white liberals to see the emergence of resistance that is not dependent on and validated by white folks or anyone else. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Basically, there is emerging in the black community the sense that we need to develop autonomous organization. We need to make sure that we can articulate our particular interests, that we're going to define for ourselves the forms of resistance, and that that does not mean that we're going to be separate from building a larger, a united front of justice, but it means that we're going to define for ourselves how we struggle. And those individuals who are prepared to ally with us, we welcome that. But we're not going to be concerned about being validated by anyone. We're not going to allow the criticism to be directed at us that we're supposed to only engage in what they define as so-called nonviolent resistance. We define for ourselves how we resist.
And then there's also the critiques of the movement that no clear leadership has emerged, and I'm wondering if that too is sort of pandering to existing frameworks of outside communities having an idea of what a movement should look like. But some people are perhaps rightfully concerned about the non-profitization of the movement. Some people and some folks in Ferguson have been concerned that nonprofits have swooped and hired some protesters and organizers, and that might sort of dilute the movement. I'm wondering what your thoughts are, a critical and perhaps a constructive criticism of the movements that are emerging.
Well, I think that the concerns are legitimate. I don't think that we have to necessarily condemn all of these various organizations if they, in fact, have been able to secure some resources to carry out the work. They don't necessarily have to, and they won't, many of them, sell themselves to these funders. But we have to be mindful, though, of the fact that the result has always been from these funders a fragmentation of our struggles. And so we've got to be very careful about that possibility. We also have to be careful about people censoring themselves. We know that there have been a couple of occasions where some of the activists from Ferguson and other places have been very clear about identifying themselves as quote-unquote non-radicals. Well, you know, some people say that's as a result of this nonprofit money. It could be. I mean, we've got to be very careful about that. But I think that what we have to understand is that we've got to have a leadership that understands the long-term objectives. It has to be independent, self-determinant. And there seems to be that kind of leadership emerging among many of the young activists across the country. But that debate in terms of how we relate to this nonprofit money is in fact happening. And I think that people are committed to maintaining an independent stance, even if it means rejecting all support from all quarters.
Thank you, as always, Ajamu Baraka, for joining us. And we'll post a link to your article from our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Ajamu Baraka is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, editor and columnist for the Black Agenda Report. And his latest article is entitled Baltimore and the Human Right to Resistance, Rejecting the Framework of the Oppressor. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The Supreme Court last week heard oral arguments on the issue of same-sex marriage. The case, Obergefell versus Hodges, consolidates 6 separate lawsuits with a total of 32 plaintiffs that are challenging gay marriage bans in Kentucky, Tennessee, Michigan, and Ohio. 2 years ago, the court issued 2 major rulings on same-sex marriage. First, on the unconstitutionality of California's Proposition 8 marriage ban, and second, on a provision of the Defense of Marriage Act, which apparently violated the Equal Protection Clause. The court is expected to make a ruling on this latest case by June. Currently, same-sex marriage is legal in 37 states. 13 states have actively banned it, either by constitutional amendment or by passing a law. My guest is Marc Solomon, the National Campaign Director of Freedom to Marry, author of Winning Marriage, the inside story of how same-sex couples took on the politicians and pundits and won. Welcome to Uprising, Marc.
Thanks for having me.
Now, for years, gay marriage opponents have been doing sort of mental gymnastics to come up with a rational opposition to marriage. What arguments did they trot out last week during oral arguments?
Well, it was actually quite impressive, the argument that they trotted out. Impressive in how really astonishingly off base it was. Their argument was that if gay couples marry, then it's going to somehow harm the institution of marriage, which will cause fewer straight couples to marry, which will then lead to more out of wedlock births, which will harm kids. And so that's, that was their argument. And the justices on our side asked over and over again, do you have any proof for that? Do you, can you justify it in any way? They had absolutely zero proof for it. Their only argument was, well, if there's even 1% chance of that happening, then we have a good reason to not allow gay couples to marry.
So it had something to do with, I understand just from reading the news, the sort of biological linking of parents and children, and somehow that being impacted by gay couples marrying. But of course, the standard responses to that, which is, for example, how do those same arguments apply to straight couples who adopt, probably don't have good answers, right?
Right. Straight couples who adopt.
Or couples who choose not to have children, yeah.
Couples who choose not to have children, couples who are too old to have children. And of course, the most powerful arguments are that, or what about gay couples who do have kids and who are raising kids and who, and whose kids are stigmatized and harmed because their parents can't get married. So it was, and there were, in this case, there's some incredibly powerful couples who have adopted kids, foster kids, and whose families are harmed because they can't get married. And so, this sort of hypothetical situation of, based on nothingness compared to the real harms to real families was quite striking.
Are defendants relying on maintaining some myth of what the typical American nuclear family consists of? And if so, how realistic is this notion? I mean, we live today in an extremely diverse country where the notion of marriage is really up for debate in many ways. There are so many children being raised by single parents or unmarried couples choosing to have children, etc., that it just seems as though that argument doesn't hold much water.
Well, I think you're right. I think that there's this sort of mantra that our opponents put forth, which is that marriage is, that every child deserves a mother and a father, and marriage is about a man and a woman. And, it really neglects, number one, the understanding of the love and commitment of same-sex couples and the so many same-sex couples who are raising kids and who are doing it in a very heroic way and who are passionate about it. They've had to be very deliberate about adopting kids and raising kids because the situation hasn't been easy for them. The system hasn't been easy for them.
How important is this particular case that the Supreme Court is hearing and going to be ruling on, expected to rule on by June? How does it fit with the rulings 2 years ago in Hollingsworth versus Perry?
Well, in Hollingworth versus Perry, the court actually punted. They let the lower court ruling stand that got rid of marriage. It got rid of the marriage ban in California, so it restored the freedom to marry in California. But the court essentially said, we're not ready yet to make a decision about whether these bans in states around the country are unconstitutional or not. So this time, after a huge amount more work and a couple dozen additional states that we've secured since then, public support at 60+% in several opinion polls. We really feel like the country is ready. And in lower courts, we've had more than 60 rulings our way over the course of the last year and a half. So the question before the court is, the primary question is, can states ban same-sex couples from marrying, or does the Constitution's guarantee of liberty and equal protection guarantee their right to marry? And it's a hugely important question. I think there's overwhelming consensus nationwide that it's time for a national resolution on that question.
So could we see a final resolution then in June, or is there a chance that the court will punt once more, as you put it?
Well, the thing about the U.S. Supreme Court is you just never know. There's always a chance of, they can do what they want. We feel very strongly that, and with some level of confidence that the court will do what we hope they'll do, which is to strike down the remaining marriage bans. And I feel confident for three reasons. First, because our advocates did a terrific job at the Supreme Court just last week. Our opponents' arguments are so bankrupt, as we talked about a little bit earlier. And then the country is truly ready with 37 states and 60+% public support.
So it seems as though there's sort of two options if they do decide to take it head on. One is that they might rule whether that no state can ban marriage, which would be the sort of brute force way of legalizing it, or that states would have to recognize legal marriages from other states. Are those the two sort of main options that the court has right now?
Yeah, those are the two questions that were argued last week and that the court is considering. We of course strongly hope that the court chooses to answer the first question, whether these bans do conform with the Constitution or not. If our side prevails on the first question.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Continue your sentence. We just lost your audio for a second.
Oh, sure. They won't even answer the second question if we prevail on the first question. So
right.
So that's what we are hoping for. And I think I'd be surprised if they were to just rule on the second. If they were to rule on the second question our way, but rule against us on the first question.
Right. And let's talk about the breakdown of votes. It appears likely that Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer will likely vote in favor of marriage. Scalia, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito will sort of reliably vote against it. That leaves Kennedy and Roberts. And so where do you think that their votes might lie? And is that sort of an accurate prediction, at least of the yay and nay votes?
It's
you just never know.
You never know. Based on history, it is an accurate portrayal. Our job is to count to 5, and 6 would be terrific. We are looking for 5. Justice Kennedy did ask some tough questions of our side, but he asked even tougher questions of our opponents. And he's written all of the major LGBT equality decisions over the course of the last 20 years. So, we have, some reasonable confidence that he would, that he'll continue in that vein, continue his real understanding of who same-sex couples are, who gay and lesbian people are, and the importance of the dignity and respect for those families as a constitutional guarantee, and their guarantee of equality and liberty under the U.S. Constitution. So.
Now, I understand that among the things the court may try to determine is the political might of the LGBT community in the U.S. If they decide that this is a community that does have political clout, justices could possibly leave it up to folks in the community to take up their cause through the legislative process. Is that a possibility?
You know, it gets into some, you know, more complicated legal doctrine, but you know, the guarantee of equal protection applies to everybody, and there are laws and constitutional amendments in many of the states where same-sex couples can't marry that single out gay couples for discrimination, and it's, you know, from our vantage point, it's a very clear equal protection argument, irrespective of the power of LGBT Americans. But just on that specific point, you know, when you go to a place like Texas or Mississippi or Alabama, I think one is very hard pressed to argue that there is clout for gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, where there are no protections even against employment discrimination and housing discrimination.
And very briefly, is it gay couples in those specifically 13 states where it's currently illegal that will be the most directly impacted by any ruling in June?
Yes, that's exactly right. It's that couples living in Texas, for example, will go from not being able to marry to being able to marry and take care of their families. So that's where it would go from no to yes.
Marc Solomon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
My guest, Marc Solomon, is the National Campaign Director of Freedom to Marry, author of Winning Marriage, the inside story of how same-sex couples took on the politicians and pundits and won. And in fact, the interview that I had done with him a few months ago about that book is available at our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. And Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Your subscription sustains the costs of our TV production. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Gohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.